Hello, everybody. It's so good to see you and to be here in person, see some familiar faces. I feel like a nerd amongst the cool kids, so thanks for slumming with me a little bit. I want to start off by taking you to 1979. Some of you may not even have been born in that year. And I want to go back to 1979 and to sort of project you into that time. Let's think about what was going on then. So these were the hottest celebrities in 1979. This was the cover of Time magazine. High medical costs. Funny how things change and also stay the same. 1979 was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So lots of things sound familiar. And then I want to take you to a meeting, not unlike this one, but a meeting at IBM. And at that meeting, they talked about artificial intelligence. And they shared this really interesting thought. A computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. So that's how it started. And this is how it's going. This picture depicts a protest at Stanford when an algorithm was used to determine who got COVID-19 vaccinations. And that algorithm assigned COVID vaccinations, which at the time were very much in demand and new, to people who were not frontline workers. So the frontline workers were overlooked by the algorithm, and people were pretty PO'd. Another example, in the UK, due to COVID, students could not sit their university exams, right? Their college entrance exams. And so they saw fit to use an algorithm to predict what their scores would have been had they sat the test based on where they were from, what their former grades were, and so on. And that created a crisis that led to the socioeconomic disadvantage being amplified. Now, what's interesting about all of these is you'll notice some language here. The algorithm clearly didn't work in the Stanford case. And the algorithm caused the grading crisis in British schools. Essentially, the algorithm made me do it. So I think about this a lot. And this is where the record would scratch, and it's like, yep, that's us. You're probably wondering how we got here. Well, I want you to think about how we got here by thinking about this scenario. Imagine that you're trying to get to campus, to MIT, you're in Cambridge, and you want to choose a route. You've decided to use Waze, the GPS app. And as you can see here, you have 3 options that are virtually identical, right? An hour and 11 minutes, give or take. Have a look at this and tell me how many people in this room would prefer option number 1? Show of hands. Okay, pretty popular. How about option 2? How many people in the room would go for 2? Okay, fewer, but still quite a few. And what about 3? How many people would choose 3? We have 1 lone brave soul. No, we've got 2 brave souls. All right. So there's no wrong answer to this, right? What you choose has to do very much with who you are as a human being. There may be an economic constraint. So you can see that 2 of these have the tolls, numbers 2 and 3. So if there's an economic constraint, number 1's starting to look pretty good. Maybe you want to avoid police, so that also makes number 1 look really good. But maybe you're looking at number 1 and you're like, gosh, that red bar looks pretty long, 42 minutes long. And at least with number 3, I can navigate. And for those of you who've driven in Boston, you know that's an adventure in and of itself. Now, if you're me, you're going to follow the algorithm pretty faithfully. And even if it says turn left, turn right off of a cliff, you're just going to follow that algorithm because it told you to do it. And if you're my husband, you're going to figure a way to beat the algorithm and not listen to it at all. How dare this GPS app tell him where to go? He's not here, so I can say that. But nevertheless, what you're seeing here is a decision made by humans that is shaped by algorithms, right? Algorithmic influence along the way. And what's important is there aren't only 3 routes to get to the campus from the starting position. There are many, many routes, but you've only been shown 3. A decision has been made to make the consideration set smaller. And so I think a lot about how humans and AI interact, what makes humans trust AI, what makes them distrust AI, and how this affects decision making. Now, all of these daily experiences with AI help us get to that how it's going. But I want to talk a little bit about how I got to this and how this became interesting to me. So this is a picture that my dear friend Scarlett took when my son was only a few weeks old. And this is me as a first-time mom. And you may be looking at this picture and you're thinking, bliss. A mom and her son, what a precious moment. And I love my son. But actually what's going on in this picture is physical exhaustion, cognitive depletion, and a real strong desire not to mess things up. So, at this very vulnerable point in time, even though I study this stuff, even though I know a lot about algorithmic bias, I became more and more likely to let algorithms tell me what to do. Right? So I started to try to reduce friction by outsourcing my cognitive tasks, my mind. So, facial recognition technology to open my phone, I wasn't too into it when it first came down. But I was so tired, I can't even type in my password. Just fine, scan my face, I don't care. Or my son, he took to sleeping like a duck takes to accounting. So he would wake up a lot. And I thought, well, why don't I just surveil him so that if he makes noise in the night, I can just look at my phone and see if I really have to get up or if he's going to turn over. Or going to the door was a hardship, especially if I was feeding him. And so I could just put the ring on and I could see who's at the door without having to move. And even changing the thermostat was too strenuous. So Alexa, set that temperature to 72 degrees. At my most vulnerable, even someone like me began to increasingly outsource my mind. And it made me think about what that means for me, what that means for you, and what that means for society at large. But you know, it's not just me, and it's not just you with Waze. It's executives all over in all kinds of industries who've caught this, what I like to call frictionless fever. So, when you're in retail settings, you may have heard about Amazon Go. Hudson and Aldi are also doing contactless shopping, where you just walk right out of the retail setting and the AI knows who you are. Your hand is your wallet. Your face is scanned. We have executives and trade publications saying the race to build the future of autonomous investing. The future of investing is frictionless, autonomous, and offers competitive ROI. If you really are a customer-first organization, then you should be putting in the time and money to eliminate friction points. The frictionless enterprise. The rise of frictionless shopping. Is your store ready? Frictionless, 2018's biggest customer experience buzzword. A frictionless future for finance. Delivering frictionless commerce. The new imperative for healthcare payers, a frictionless cure, a frictionless care experience. And the fast and the frictionless, which I think is a movie with Vin Diesel. I think they're on like sequel number 10. I'm not sure, but sounds very exciting. Fast and frictionless. So this frictionless fever has really swept, right, industries. And it makes sense. I get it. I get it because from a behavioral economics perspective, and I am a behavioral scientist, we know that the average human makes 35,000 choices per day. You chose which seat, you chose what to wear. So some of these are trivial, some of these are heavy, but all of these choices lead to cognitive load, right? And so we need to get through that and get through our days. And so fortunately for us, our minds have this division of labor. So let me do a pop quiz. I am a professor, of course, so I'm going to give you a pop quiz, but there won't be any homework, rest assured. So you're driving on a road that looks like this, right? And out pops this creature. What are you going to do? So I hear brake, slow down. I'm sure there's someone in the room who's going to say, well, it depends on the moisture on the road and the mass of the animal. But most of you, if not all of you, would sort of automatically take your foot to go to the brake, right? Now let's look at a different decision. Let's say after this we all go out for drinks, which, can we do that? And let's say you're charged with choosing the wine for the group. And you see this wine list, which is pretty robust. How are you going to choose the wine? So how many people here might ask someone for help? Maybe the server or a sommelier, yeah. How many people here would think about what they're eating and try to do some sort of match accordingly, right? How many people would say, I don't want to buy the most expensive one, but I also don't want to buy the cheapest one? How many people would just go for the cheapest one? Yes, I love the honesty. Now, these are two different choices, right? And what really makes them different is that the first one is automatic, right? And that's your system one. That's your fast thinking. And the second one is more deliberative cognitively, right? That's your thinking slow. And you're nodding your heads likely because you've read or heard of Thinking Fast and Slow, the Nobel Prize winning work by Daniel Kahneman. Now, because we have all of these choices, and we have system one, which is very automatic, and we have system two, which is deliberative, our brains are amazing as well because we sort of are able to focus on limited things at one time. So we can process about as much as what fits on a Post-it note at any given time. It's why texting and driving is a really bad idea, right? Because we just simply can't consciously process too many things. Fortunately for us, our non-conscious processes are working very well. And so because of this Post-it note effect, this system one automatic thinking that also is bounded by this sort of inability to process everything at the same time, we have an emphasis on trying to get rid of friction. So for instance, in healthcare, 70% of Americans feel that healthcare, the system is difficult to navigate. And think about taxes, right? Everybody's supposed to do their taxes. Ostensibly, the government wants us to do it. But it is so difficult and complex and confusing that oftentimes people put it off, pay someone else to do it, or just cross their fingers and hope for the best. In fact, when we think about system one and system two, our system one kicks in automatically and starts working on about 95% of our processing, whether or not it's the best way to go. Because of this, then, what do? We nudge and try to reduce sludge. Nudging, changing the structure of a setting in order to increase the probability that people will make the optimal choice. Let me give you an example here. Nudging via default. So if you look at this bar chart, and you'll see that the countries along the blue line are countries where registered voters are organ donors. The countries with the yellow bars are countries where registered voters, drivers are also organ donors. But you can see that there's a relative paucity in those yellow bar countries. What makes the difference is not the healthcare system, it's not religion. It's the fact that in the blue bar countries, you are a donor by default. And then you have to opt out of being a donor. Nudging by default. Now, this is a very nice and pro-social opportunity here, right? In the United States, we have 7 or 8 people die waiting for a kidney every day. The United States is not one of those default donor nations, and wouldn't that be amazing how many people we could help? So we nudge and we try to remove sludge to leverage that system one processing, to make it easier for us to make these decisions. Think about this metaphor. Chutes and ladders, or depending upon where you were raised, snakes and ladders. You know the game. Now this version is a version from my young son's book, and he has a tendency to flip words around. So what you'll notice with this Chutes and Ladders is that it's an inverted Chutes and Ladders. And I want to show this to you because it really depicts quite nicely the strategy of nudging. You see, in this inverted version, you are at the start, and of course your objective is to get to the finish. Now, if you land on the pink square, the pink rectangle, you're going to make progress toward that finish, but you're going to have to descend a ladder, right? Now, let's contrast that with if you landed on the red rectangle. You're gonna slide on down, easy peasy breezy. What you're seeing with this metaphor is sort of a graphical depiction of systems 1 and 2 and nudging. So moving down ladders, it's effortful. You have to focus. The risk is apparent. In fact, in this picture, the guy's doing it the wrong way. Oftentimes even you need a second person to hold the ladder for you. So you're moving forward, but it's a very different experience than sliding down a slide, a chute, right? It's simple. The entire system is set up for this. It's called gravity. And you really don't have to do much at all. In fact, children and even adults have been known to say, "Wee," going down a slide. It's so delightful and low effort. This really maps to our system 2, which is often high friction, more deliberative. What's 17 times 23 times 8? I can't tell you right now, but I know it would take some time. Very different process, right, than system 1, which is a low friction, immediate decision. And it is why frictionless fever has spread, because behavioral economics helps us understand that we need to get out of our own way. And that if we want people to make optimal decisions in compressed time with lots of distractions, then we probably should design it so that their system 1 can make that choice quickly. But, and there's always a but, frictionless fever assumes that system 1 is the one that you should leverage. And let me tell you, this is not an appropriate strategy for AI. So I'm going to start with have a second pop quiz. What percentage of AI is biased? That's right, 100%. 100% of AI is biased because it's trained on historical data, right? And so what happened in the past may not necessarily represent what's happening in the future, especially if the group you're in was barred from certain access. It's also programmed by human beings who are biased themselves. But even without malintent, an algorithm or machine learning can go down a biased route. And so when we think about this, frictionless is problematic. It's problematic because oftentimes AI is assumed to be neutral. And let me tell you, my friends, it is not. So let me give you an example. In healthcare, where people can scan their skin to find out if they have different skin conditions, eczema, skin cancer, etc. Or maybe another example where in hiring, a company called HireVue scans people's faces to see whether or not they're affable, good for interviewing, and going to be a nice member of the team. Both of these things sample historical biased data. And as a result, if more patients have lighter skin, well, if you're a darker skin patient like me, you're SOL. Let me show you another example. This is a company that aimed to improve the diagnosticity of big data. So you've got all these data points, you've got all these customers, and the question is, which are female and which are male? It might be a good question to answer if, for instance, you're trying to sell something that would be segmented or targeted. So let's have a look at this algorithm, shall we? You put a name into the window. So let's put in Megan Smith. And the algorithm will predict the likelihood of Megan being male or female. All right, 60% plus probability that she's female. Now we put doctor in front of Megan Smith. And now we've got 76% probability that she's a man, Dr. Megan Smith. Why? Because in the past, women were not permitted to be physicians, right? And there were many, many barriers to this. And so this is why 100% of AI is biased, and this is why frictionless is a problematic strategy as we develop artificial intelligence, or augmented intelligence to be more accurate, and machine learning. Now, meanwhile, firms are running at breakneck pace to catch up and adopt as much AI as possible. $50 billion has already been spent in the year 2020, according to McKinsey, and that's expected to double this year. As you can see here, for instance, in healthcare, artificial intelligence generating excitement. 70% of these firms purchase AI from vendors. They're not building it. Somebody else did. Prefab AI, if you will. And those same executives, when polled, 65% of them say, I have no idea how this thing works. I also think that's an underestimate. It's probably closer to 90. So we see these things happening, right? We see the problem starting to emerge. So this is actually from a Dr. Seuss book called The Sleep Book. And in the Sleep Book, there is a machine that processes and is able to predict and track how many sleepers there are in the entire world. Counting up sleepers, just how do we do it? Really quite simple. There's nothing much to it. We find out how many, we learn the amount by an audio-teleo-talio count. On a mountain, halfway between Reno and Rome, we have a machine in a plexiglass dome, which listens and looks into everyone's home. And whenever it sees a new sleeper go flop, it jiggles and lets a new biggle ball drop. Our chap counts those balls as they plop in a cup, and that's how we know who is down and who's up. I like this, not only because it rhymes, but because you start to see threads of surveillance, and because it really depicts the black box of AI. Shiny, interesting, cool new algorithms in AI that we're not sure how they work. And if this is your firm, it's your business to know how that works. And so this is why we should be thinking more about friction, because we may be creating the perfect storm. AI bias meeting human bias, frictionlessly applied, can create this kind of catastrophe. So what does this look like in my research? I'm not going to tell you about all of my research because I like you all too much to do that to you. But I'll share with you just a little bit of it to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about this and what we're seeing. So imagine a scenario where we have a gentleman named Jerry. And Jerry is in a position of power. He's the decision maker. And he's making a decision. He's evaluating someone else, this fellow named Bernard. Now, Jerry and Bernard are not real. I mean, these are real people, but they're not really Jerry and Bernard. We use them in our experiments, right? So Jerry is making a decision. He's evaluating Bernard. And we, in our experiments, randomly assign people to different conditions. In one condition, Jerry is making a decision with regard to healthcare. Bernard thinks he has some kind of problem, and Jerry is dismissive of him. In another situation, Bernard is an applicant for admissions to school, and Jerry doesn't think he can cut it. In another scenario, Bernard is a defendant who claims innocence, and Jerry has an inkling that he's probably guilty. So in these experiments, we asked, well, what would happen if AI contributed to a negative outcome? Because all of those are negative outcomes. And we know they're negative outcomes because in these scenarios, we update them with information that turns out reveals that Jerry was wrong. So in the healthcare setting, Bernard indeed knew what he was talking about. He had a condition. And this is something that Black patients experience often, right? Black women, maternal health care, pain. In admissions, Jerry finds out that Bernard wasn't admitted, but he went elsewhere and became a rock star. And in the criminal justice setting, turns out new information shows that Bernard, in fact, was not guilty. So what would happen then if we said that Jerry made this decision and we randomly assigned people to 2 conditions? Actually, to 3. In one condition, Jerry just makes the decision by himself. In the second condition, Jerry receives input from a fellow human, an expert in the organization. And in the third condition, Jerry receives input from an algorithm. The decision he makes is always the same. But the question is, would Jerry be held more or less accountable if you knew that his decision, which turned out to be biased, was made with input from an AI? Well, it's an important question to ask because we're seeing scenarios like this. Predictive policing, for instance, where people are being arrested, even someone was shot twice, because AI predicted, very Minority Report style, that movie with Tom Cruise, that they were going to commit the crime, even though they had not yet. And testing software that scans students' faces for teachers to know who's paying attention and how to grade, right, has been shown to be biased against students with darker skin colors. So what happened? What we found in our experiments is that when you incorporate AI into the decision, Jerry is held less accountable. In fact, Jerry is held accountable to a level that is commensurate with if Jerry had conferred with another human. So there's something called diffusion of responsibility. If you make a decision with a team, with a group, you are responsible for 1/n of that decision. If it were 4 people, you're sort of 25% responsible. It's a diffusion of responsibility. Turns out, AI can also diffuse this responsibility. Back to our original scenarios, the algorithm made me do it. So when we think about the classic trolley problem, right, from the 60s, where you have a choice to make. There's a trolley that's running and it's out of control. And there are 2 tracks on which this trolley could go. And you decide which track the trolley will ride on. The one that has 5 people tied to it, or the one that has 1 individual tied to it. It's a difficult choice, but it's used oftentimes in philosophy and morality classes to get us to think about these things. Well, what if you didn't have to make the choice? An algorithm could do it for you. Would that make you feel less guilty? Would that take you off the hook? These are things that we're grappling with now, and we need to think about because lawsuits, risk, and harm mean we have to consider the degree to which we are training human beings to outsource decisions to AI that can be biased and problematic. I question the algorithms because it would have questioned me. If you were to look at my background, my profile, you would never expect me to be here. I am the first-generation daughter of immigrants from a small, poor country in the Caribbean. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I was born and raised in Flatbush, Brooklyn, during a time where the crack epidemic ravaged. I saw my mom get mugged. There were crack vials at the bus stop. And when I think about algorithms, I think about the fact that they never would have predicted that I'd be on this stage, that I would have gone to Harvard, that I would have been an MIT professor. So I take this very, very personally. But you should too. What data point in your profile would make a rational algorithm lower your value? Maybe it's your gender. Maybe it's your race. Maybe it's your sexuality. Maybe you have a pre-existing condition. Maybe it's your age. But should all of these things be frictionless? Should all of this be cooking in the background without your knowing? And these are the questions that I want you to think about after you leave today. We need to think about it because we've become so allergic to friction that we're avoiding it at our own peril. It's too easy. But I think we should take a cue from our friends in physics. In physics, friction is neither good nor bad. In fact, when you look at this runner, you'll see that in these equations, friction is depicted in his feet. Friction is what allows him to accelerate. It's what allows you to change direction. With too much friction, you end up with corns on your feet, and nobody wants that. But with too little friction, you slide and you fall. So friction is neither good nor bad, and we need to take a physics approach to friction and think about where can we get rid of bad friction and where can we add good friction. What if we've been thinking about friction all wrong? What if in our frictionless strategies we've been looking at the wrong variable? Our unit of analysis has been volume, more friction or less. Or our unit of analysis has been speed. We got to get through faster. Faster is better. What if instead we could think about the chutes and ladders and turn it right side up and wonder when should it be right side up and when should it be upside down? And when then should our frictionless strategy change? What if we looked at these things not in terms of volume of friction, but as a journey that has multiple linked touch points. And at each touch point, humans make decisions. And we should look at times when those decisions should be frictionless, like donating organs. And times where we should stop and think again, like predictive policing. What if we thought about automaticity in a new way? And what if we didn't take the human out of this, but we actually centered the human in these processes? Now, we're all familiar with getting rid of bad friction. This is a picture of Whole Foods, and if you can read the sign, it says, gloves and/or hand sanitizer are recommended before using utensils in this self-service area. Thank you. What's wrong with this picture? I can't see the gloves or the hand sanitizer. That's bad friction, right? Now I gotta go looking for it. I've gotta ask somebody for help. So we're well-versed in eliminating friction. But I wanna think about ways in which we can be more nuanced than that and eliminate bad friction and add good friction. And I wanna share with you 4 steps for you to think about. The first is take a beat and ask, should AI be doing this? And even, can it? Can AI predict accurately who's going to commit a crime? Spoiler, no. This was a recent Clubhouse discussion. Should AI make life or death decisions? No. If you remember one thing, remember this. So that's 1. 2, look at these journeys, deconstruct them, and then audit these journeys for touch points that would benefit from added friction. A good example of this are model cards, which were developed by a wonderful team of researchers, Margaret Mitchell, Timnit Gebru, and others at Google at the time. And they devised these model cards, which are sort of like the side of a cereal box. So you know how much protein and riboflavin and what daily calorie count they are assuming. Well, model cards are sort of like the same thing. They tell you what's in this model, who was it trained on, when is it wrong, what is the error rate, where could bias creep in. This added friction could help us make better decisions about when to deploy AI, what kind of AI to deploy, and really cut down on bias that we can't get rid of completely, but that we could think of in a more System 2 way, creating a system that makes it easier for us to think about this. 3, embrace friction in the form of inclusivity. Turns out that only 6% of leaders in organizations care about diversifying their development teams for AI to combat bias. But we know from research, even without AI, that heterogeneous groups are far better for these types of tasks. So colleagues of mine at MIT ran experiments where they randomly assigned people to be in homogeneous groups or heterogeneous groups, and they gave them a task. And that task was to predict a price of a stock. Well, when you're in a homogeneous group, it feels a lot more comfortable at first. These are people like me. I'm amongst my people. When you're in a heterogeneous group, it's a little bit different. It may be uncomfortable. But after that initial discomfort, the performance in the heterogeneous group is far superior. As you can see, the mean accuracy is much higher in the diverse group than in the homogeneous group. This means we need to get more inclusive and diverse groups building these models, evaluating them, thinking about who other than the people the models were trained on might be affected by this. Where could harm show up? And how can we make sure we're not amplifying and augmenting inequality? Number 4, build a culture of experimentation and test the model before releasing it. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But you'd be surprised how many times the model is released and it's, oh, the algorithm did it. So there are ways you can do this. Microsoft has Fair Learn, and that can help you practice your algorithm and show where there's errors on a sample group so there won't be real harm experienced. But the thing about experiments and experimental culture is that it is a good form of friction. It's good because you will fail many, many times. But when you succeed, it is so valuable. That is good friction because that leads to innovation, that reduces risk, and that increases the likelihood that people will explore advantage that otherwise might be taken for granted. And number 5, I told you 4, but I'm giving you a bonus. Eliminate dark patterns. Now, you may be familiar with dark patterns. These are manipulative tricks, psychological tricks that are often used, right? But I want to talk to you about a particular type of dark pattern, asymmetric friction, what I call digital lobster traps. I live in Boston, so I got to do something with seafood. So a lobster trap, how it works, you put the bait in, the lobster goes in to get the bait, it tries to leave, and it's extremely difficult to get out of there. Digital lobster traps are being used with AI to make it easy for people to get in, give up their data, give up their privacy, and hard to get out. So an example of this, Facebook, when WhatsApp was acquired, said, we're not going to sort of mix the streams here. We're going to respect the data we get from WhatsApp and from Facebook and Instagram, and never the twain shall meet. A few years down the road, well, we're updating our terms and privacy policy. And by the way, if you don't agree, over time, you won't be able to access your chat. You won't be able to respond to a message or call back. And after a few weeks of limited functionality, WhatsApp will stop sending messages and calls to your phone. That's a lobster trap. We got you. And you can't get out. So I want to play a little game, if you're up for it. Spot the lobster trap. Ready? All right. Number 1 is a high-tech motorcycle vest. So it's a vest that uses AI to predict when you're getting into a crash. It can assess the velocity of your body and really understand ostensibly that you're about to hit the pavement and puff up to give you extra protection. Here's the product. Where's the lobster trap? Indeed, it will stop working if you miss a payment. So you can purchase it, but then we've got you, and your functionality reduces. So that was a pretty straightforward one. Let's give you another example. Pop-ups and upselling. So let's imagine you're using a photo app, you're taking your pictures, you're doing a little retouching, no judgment, and you're using the app, and up pops this, a premium version for you to purchase. You've decided, not interested right now. Where's the lobster trap? Exactly. How do I get out of this? This is the X. Camouflaged. Lobster trap. And let me give you one more. Modifying your cookie preferences. So you've decided you want to change the amount of data you give, and you want to modify those cookie preferences, right? So you've gone into your app to make that modification. Where's the lobster trap? Well, there are actually two. First, processing, 29%. That's a long way from 100. And so you're probably going to say, you know what, screw it, just cancel. I'm not going to change my cookie preferences, right? Making that really protracted, easy to get in, hard to get out. Also, by default, you've accepted the cookies. You now have to opt out. So that's using a nudge in a way that's actually a dark pattern. Lobster traps. So, congratulations on this game. I think you've earned something. I would give you all red suits, but in lieu of this, a red lobster sandal might do. And this is a real thing that you can purchase on Amazon. So I don't have a QR code, but you can certainly search for that. So Albert Einstein said, "It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." And I have great respect for Albert Einstein, but I'm trying to be a little bit more optimistic than that. So human-AI interaction holds a lot of promise, but I encourage you to practice acts of inconvenience. Get up instead of having the surveillance tool do it for you. Read through those terms of service. Use your voice and demand better, more transparent and responsible AI. Human beings are certainly imperfect, we're certainly biased, and we're certainly emotional. But there's not a better processing system on this earth yet. So anything we develop should still always be human first. I'll leave you with a quote from Steve Jobs. It's not a faith in technology, it's faith in people. Let's not program out the human, but rather make our AI human-centered. Thank you so much for your attention and for being here. So, and please do stay in touch. That's my Twitter handle. If you have questions, please feel free to come to the mic. There's one right here. And I do believe there is an opportunity for people to ask questions on the app. But you should use the microphone because this is being streamed and recorded, and your voice won't be picked up otherwise. Hello.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I guess a simple question, but I presume that you're pretty against autopilot, self-driving cars then? Would you classify that as life or death?
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've heard about some really negative experiences, accidents, and things of that nature. What I'd like to do is some experiments to look at how humans sort of shift according to autopilot. There's been some research, and essentially this research has shown that when humans are in vehicles on autopilot, their reaction time lengthens, right? So it's slower. So indeed, there is a training that happens and a shift with the human. And so we need to design with that certainly in mind. So thank you for the question. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
As large organizations, the enterprise starts focusing on productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness powered by AI, what would you say to the COO of one of these 70,000 people enterprises that is thinking about the best way to automate without losing the human centricity?
Yeah.
From a governance perspective, particularly.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I like to use a framework that I call DDPE. I find that frameworks make it easier for us to sort of systematize these processes and bake in on purpose friction. Because friction that's not anticipated creates a lot of cognitive stress, right? But DDPE stands for deconstruct, describe, prescribe, and experiment. So this is a process that teams should and could go through with regard to AI, but actually not limited to that. The first is deconstruct, right? So I'm sure you've all heard about like customer journeys. Deconstruct that journey. What is the process by which these decisions are being made? Where does AI crop up? And so on. Deconstruct, then describe. Describe what the human is doing. This last question about human beings having a slower reaction time when it comes to driverless vehicles, right? These are the types of questions, these are the types of things we need to measure and be able to accurately describe. If we cannot accurately describe the impact the technology is having on people within the organization and outside of the organization, then we are flying blind and we have no right to do that. So deconstruct, describe, then prescribe. Get the team together and think about what is the solution here, right? What can we do? And there are many, many nudges that could be deployed in this case, and you can consider that one of them could solve the problem, but that's not enough. Then you need to test it, and that's where the E comes in, experiment. And experimentation is the only form of data gathering that allows you to make causal statements. Everything else is just correlation, right? So by doing these experiments and creating a culture of experimentation, you make it easier, you make it like a system one, actually, for people to really add good friction. So that's the way I approach these. And when I talk to organizations, we go through these steps, and I believe it helps. Yes, hello.
Hi. Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
Back to your point about diffusion of responsibility, I think for your average person, that's probably a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
And in fact, that may be the feature, is not having to feel responsibility for decision making.
Yeah.
And we see that out here in the real world, where people will outsource their decision making to a group or to somebody they admire or anything like that. So I'm just curious your thoughts on just that general human proclivity to not want to be responsible for decisions.
Yeah.
And looking at AI as being the way to help me do that, avoid that.
So the real scenario has really cropped up during COVID. So as you know, there have been insufficient numbers of ventilators for the numbers of people who need them. And so physicians and other medical staff have been in the unenviable position of basically deciding who lives or dies because of this resource constraint. And so there's been talk about allowing an AI to make this decision to alleviate some of that stress that the human may have. I'm not convinced that it will work. I'm convinced that in our experiments, observers would hold him less or them less responsible. I'm not convinced, however, that they would go about their business and not still feel a tremendous guilt. We know that military personnel who use drones and other kinds of technology to be able to essentially fight long distance still feel those same feelings. So we're fooling ourselves if we think that by outsourcing this, it won't affect our humanity. It's scary, though, to me, for the observer to be able to say, well, it wasn't you. It was the algorithm. And it's also scary to me to think that an algorithm would say, well, this person has a pre-existing condition, so they probably won't do very well. So let's give the ventilator to someone else. These are the kinds of things that AI was not meant to do and should not be doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for giving us so many doubts about everything. So I don't know if I'm gonna sleep tonight. Anyway, starting with the business I'm building now is a platform of female leaders and as a network to prepare others to become leaders as we are, right?
Yeah.
So we have already 150 women.
Wonderful.
A diverse universe of different professionals. However, I'm using, actually was a curiosity of me, of using a personality test in this sample, and I'm finding out that we are not that diverse at all.
Interesting.
So basically, in 4 families of personality, we leaders, we are in 2 only. And it's not a diverse, and are we AI? And that's what I'm at question here. Are we AI machine? So how can, introducing human being to question these decisions, are we really daring things?
Yeah.
So that's more like, because my doubt is coming, questions
No,
coming into my mind.
that's fascinating. So I didn't share it because of scope, but so I have another project that my colleague and I worked on where we tried to answer the question, well, who trusts AI? And we used the lens of cognitive style. So everyone has system 1 and system 2. Some are system 1 dominant and others are system 2 dominant. And it turns out that there's a difference in one's proclivity to use AI according to cognitive style. It turns out that system 1 dominant people, the people who go with their intuition and their gut, exhibit what we call algorithmic aversion. That is, they would prefer to receive input from a human being when given the choice. However, system 2 dominant people exhibit what we call algorithmic appreciation. They actually would prefer the algorithm to the human. Now, the thing about this is that when it comes to cognitive style, people who tend to be in leadership positions are often system 2 dominant people. Why? Because system 2 is associated with being able to defer reward, right? So I'm not going to go to the party tonight. I'm going to do my homework so I can do well in school. System 2 people are more likely to think through things in a deliberative fashion. So they're less likely to, for instance, as my colleague has shown, believe fake news. If these are the types of cognitive styles that are likely in the position to decide who gets a loan, who gets admitted to school, right, who gets an investment, then those are the very people we should actually be having this conversation with. So I do hope, regardless of the cognitive style of the folks in your group, that this conversation happens, because those are the very people that we need to be at the front lines of that.
Thank you.
Sure. There's something online here. Can AI become less biased over time? Some might argue when some AI like genderifies bias, it is because of a mistake. They just need more data. Yes, that's a question from Mads. Thank you so much. AI can improve its prediction. However, AI over time can also become more biased. It depends on the criteria by which it understands success or accuracy. And even if it's accurate in saying that there's a higher probability that a doctor is going to be male versus female, that is not necessarily something that we want to reify and amplify. And so this is really a problem that we need to think about very consciously. Thank you for your question. What is your perspective on AI being implemented to present decision makers' biases other than their own for better and more diverse situational awareness? I'm not quite sure what this means, but it sounds like what you're saying is AI would be generating opposing perspectives or opposing points of view. I actually think that that's a great use for AI. Right? It's not going to ultimately make the decision, but it could get people to consider different perspectives, which is a really important part of reducing bias. So I really like the idea. Ultimately, though, the human should make the decision, and whatever biases there may be should be uncovered and evaluated. AI bias is true, but it's also true that there are techniques to solve some of them. Does AI could be used to highlight these human prejudices? Absolutely. AI can actually be effective in helping us understand that there are biases that exist. So I think that the ideal, the sort of sweet spot would be this complementary human-AI interaction. Unfortunately, many times the conversation is about replacing human cognitive load with AI. That is not the conversation that we should be having. The conversation we should be having is, how can we get people to use their cognitive effort on things that really are meaningful to them, that cannot be replicated, and that are rooted in human-first principles? Those are the questions we should be asking, as opposed to, how can we get AI to hire people for us so we don't have to read as many resumes? Is AI inherently different than historical business processes, algorithms enforced by people? Or is it the same societal factor, worsened by scalability? Thank you for your question, Brandon. The scalability problem is one I think about quite a bit. Is it inherently different? I actually don't think so. Some might argue that it's statistics on steroids, but you didn't hear me say that. The scalability problem, though, is real because no matter how many DE&I training sessions you go to, a biased algorithm is far more efficient in creating and replicating bias. So without being careful about responsible AI, all of these other efforts are really going to be ineffective. Yes, hi.
Hi, good morning. I have a question about actually the responsibility of CEOs with regards to your topic, because what I see today is that from the moment the economical KPIs come up, this kind of discussions go into the same as the other SDGs, and
Yes.
then they're just checkboxes, but in the end, it's not actually being used. And I wondered how you, as a professor and also in your talks, try to convince CEOs to actually take the time and also the money to look at this kind of systems from a human-centered perspective.
Two ways. Number one, change the KPI. The KPI should be about, what did we learn from this experiment? Did we test our data? Not, did we extract as much as possible from our customers? And number two, turns out when we abuse customers with algorithms, privacy, etc., it's far more expensive to make up for it. Call centers get flooded, trust is eroded, competitors benefit. So it is good business practice, on top of ethical, of course, for these KPIs to be changed and for this to become central to the business. For CEOs, they've got to support this with resources. It comes from the top down. So it's a very important question, and thank you for asking it. So I am out of time. I just want to thank everybody for being here. It's really been a pleasure. I'm going to hang around for a couple minutes outside if you have any other questions, but enjoy the rest of the conference. Stay safe, and thank you so very much.